And we are back. This is Zach from Christian Wilderness, and the subject this week is going to be hell. Hell yeah. Or the word hell will bring up different kind of thoughts in different people. But I'm going to have a look at hell and the words used that is translated as hell in the Bible, just to have a little bit of a closer look. Just to have a look. I know it seems a bit morbid talking about hell, but I'm just going to attempt to clarify what seemed to be, to me, it looks like some misconceptions possibly. And there's actually some different biblical views of hell out there, all with some kind of biblical textual support. But it evokes different thoughts from different people, and I just want to have a closer look. Now, I don't consider myself a teacher of the Bible at all. You know, this is quite a new YouTube channel. I just want to get my thoughts out there for posterity, if you like. Even if the only people who watch are like my kids. So this is for them. This is for anyone who's interested in my thoughts. So what is hell exactly? And is it something that we need to fear? Okay. Or put the threat out to people, like, if you don't do or believe X, Y, Z, then you're going to hell. So I'm calling this my sixth heresy because I don't have the orthodox view again. And I think that my view is a bit better news than what traditionally people might say hell is all about. So that's always nice when speaking of the gospel of the kingdom, right? That we've got good news rather than bad news. I think Jesus, when he was talking about hell, had a threat and some bad news about hell. But as we get more and more into this, I hope that you can see that had a time and place. So the traditional view is that hell is a place where bad people go to be either tortured endlessly or completely annihilated. So let me say right from the get-go that I actually rarely bump into people who believe in eternal conscious torment, which is great. I mean, I'm mainly talking to people on Facebook, in Facebook groups, and it seems like you're researching Christian these days kind of rejects the whole eternal conscious torment thing, which I think we're going in the right direction. I think the conversation moving forward is going to involve the two opinions about annihilationism, which is that bad people are kind of, they get a judgment and they're kind of annihilated from existence, also known as conditional immortality. It's going to be between that and another view, which is that of universal reconciliation, which means that people are neither annihilated or tormented endlessly, but there might be a third option. It is a bit more fringe in modern times, this view. And I'm going to get more into universal reconciliation next time out, as, if you like, my seventh and final heresy at the moment. But I think that the character of God is in question here. When we talk about hell, and what happens after you die. And this thing between annihilationism and eternal conscious torment, I want to ask people who are now annihilationists, like, is viewing God as a permanent destroyer of souls better than an endless tormentor of souls? I mean, I'm still asking, what is the purpose, to extermination of post-mortem souls, other than just cruelty? Or, there seems to be a purpose in earthly judgment, because that will have definite changes on earth. But what exactly is the purpose in annihilating someone from existence? Even if you say that that's a punishment, is there not a better punishment available? So I want to put forward my premise, which is that these are the different words used that are translated as hell in our Bible. So let's identify the terms that we have, and I'll give you my premise of what they mean. Okay, so Sheol, which pops up in the Old Testament, I think just means the grave, basically. It's pretty bad, good, neutral. It's neutral with regards who goes there. So it seems to be a place for both righteous and wicked, and it's particular to the Old Covenant world. That's something I also want to look into. Hades, I think, is the Greek equivalent of Sheol, and that's used in the New Testament. Gehenna is an interesting one. My premise is that is going to be a concept of judgment to Old Covenant Israel, and I don't think it's a realm of the dead there. And there's another one, Tartarus, which is a very unique reference, and it seems to look like it was a place that was a place of testing, but it's unique. And when the Bible puts hell there as a word, I'm not sure about this, but I believe that word comes from the Norse goddess Hel, hell, who's a goddess of the afterlife. So not sure that word has any business actually being in the Bible, but I just think maybe the translators would have been better off sticking as much as they could to the original words that were in it, and then people could have researched what those words actually mean. So I think a lot of modern translations are actually leaving the word hell out a bit more for the original words, which is good. Gehenna is the one mainly used by Jesus in relation to judgment, and I think it's quite a complex concept, but the word hell is used by modern translations for Gehenna. So we'll look into that as well. So let's start with Sheol, which is in the Hebrew Bible. As I mentioned, it's a neutral place. It's where everyone goes when they die in the Old Covenant. There's nothing really pointing to Sheol being a place where people are permanently annihilated or tortured. So we have seen it associated sometimes with fire, but fire doesn't necessarily mean something bad in the Old Testament or the New Testament, actually. It is depicted sometimes as kind of a shadowy underworld as well. And let's dig into it a little bit more with Strong's Concordance. So it is a Hebrew word. It means the world of the dead, basically. sometimes depicted as a subterranean retreat, like it's down there kind of thing. But very neutral connotation to it. So I don't think many people would disagree with that about Sheol, okay? And even Strong says that Sheol is Hades and Hades is Sheol. So if we move on to Hades now, that's the Greek equivalent of Sheol, okay? Used in the New Testament, describes the grave, again, the realm of the dead. And one thing I want to point out is that Hades is thrown into the lake of fire in Revelation. So I don't think that we can say that Hades is the final destination for anyone, right? So if we have a look at Luke 16 here, this is clearly there's someone in this parable receiving some kind of correctional treatment or sorrow in Hades. So the poor man died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. So rich man, poor man, both going to Hades. The rich man also died and was buried, and in Hades, being in torment, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham far off and Lazarus at his side. And he called out, Father Abraham, have mercy on me and send Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in water and cool my tongue. I am in anguish, which means grieved, sorrowed, in this flame. So it's a depiction of Hades. Okay, we don't know if this is literal or a metaphor. Okay, but because it's in a parable, I'd lean towards metaphor. Does it mean permanent torment? I don't know. I don't know why God would torment anyone endlessly. But let's have a little look at what the word torment means. It's basanos, Greek word, and it means to basically to test or to prove the genuineness of a thing. It could mean kind of interrogation. You know, originally it meant a touchstone used to test the purity of gold. So there's this rich man in Hades being tested, okay, and it's causing him sorrow, but we don't know that that's the end of him, okay. So it's not really talking about torture outright. By analogy, it could mean torture, but I think we could leave it at meaning testing there, or maybe an interrogation. Okay. So in Revelation, what I mentioned earlier, death and Hades are thrown into the lake of fire. Okay. So Hades, this realm of the dead, is not endless fire. It can't be. And just going out to my full preterist friends, you especially should be noting this, that, I mean, we all think that Revelation is over and done with in the first century, right? So Hades, as it was like a realm of the dead, it doesn't exist anymore as it was before that time. Okay. So Sheol is not a permanent place where people are burning, either endlessly or being annihilated. Hades, the Greek equivalent, isn't either, especially if you're a full preterist. But even if you're not a futurist, I mean, eventually a futurist has to say, yeah, death and Hades is thrown into the lake of fire. So it can't be endless torture. You know, futurists might believe that all this happens in our future, but I would point them to passages that teach that Christ was victorious over death. He said, though you may die, you will live. And Paul quotes Hosea saying, O death, where is thy sting? So this seems to be kind of clearly saying that death was in the process of being overcome because of the events of the first century. I'm referring to 1 Corinthians 15:55 and Hosea 13:14, which both talk about the power of Sheol and death, which will be redeemed from. So if you believe that we are redeemed, death, the sting of death, which is sin, the strength of sin, which is the law, the old covenant law, hasn't that all been done away with? So, I would argue from that Hades has been dealt with. Okay? So I don't think that can be the destination where we go when we physically die. Let me show you Matthew 16 here. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell, which is Hades, shall not prevail against it. So here, Hades is on very much the defensive. Okay, the church is breaking down Hades, defenses, if you like, and will overcome it. That's the basic message. So in summary of Hades, it looks like it's a place for the dead that someone might receive correction in the past, but it's obviously been beaten by Jesus and the church, and it has no standing now in the current messianic age. That's the way I would approach this as a full preterist myself. So Hades is gone. It's already been defeated with death. Now, if Hades was the place of the realm of the dead, then if we don't die anymore, as Jesus said, then we don't go to Hades. And I think most Christians would agree that when we die, we go and be with God, right? Whereas I don't think that happened before in the Old Covenant. I think people kind of slept and went to be with their fathers wherever they were, which seems to have been Sheol and Hades, right? So moving on swiftly, let's have a look at Gehenna, which Jesus talks a lot about, but only actually on 3 different occasions, if I'm not mistaken. So Gehenna, I believe this was a place outside Jerusalem, an actual place. And it was used for child sacrifice, which is a horrible thing to talk of, but it did go on. Okay. But I think Jesus, he does talk about it to Israel, and he does associate it with fire, and he does associate it with judgment also. Let's have a look at the definition of it. Gehenna. In the Greek, it's Gehenna. In the Hebrew, it's the Valley of Hinnom. Okay, which is, it's certainly mentioned in the OT as a pretty grim and wicked place with regards things that we don't need to talk about really, but involving other gods, okay, offerings to other gods. There's innocent blood involved there. There is fortune telling and omens and sorcery and mediums and necromancy. So in the Old Testament, it was called the Valley of Hinnom, okay? And it was later called the Valley of Slaughter, also known as Tophet. When it was brought over into the Greek, it was called Gehinnom. That's what my research is telling me anyway. So that's I think Ge means valley and Hinnom is this guy's name. So the Valley of Hinnom is Gehinnom. And I think this place, Gehenna or Gehinnom, was understood at the time of Jesus. This is the premise that I'm going off, is that it was understood at that time by the rabbis and by the scribes, etc., as it turned into a kind of a concept where there would be punishment, or where people would be punished and would do also in a future national judgment. So it was a very unpleasant place, okay, of fiery judgment. I don't think it's associated with endless punishment, though, or complete and utter annihilation from existence permanently. Physical death. I mean, it might be the permanent annihilation of your physical body, but what I'm seeing is that it's a quite hazy concept, but we are far removed from the first century, so we can't blame ourselves. We can't really know how Gehenna was understood perfectly, but I don't think that we can view this as a realm of the dead at all. That's what I'm going to work off for the purposes of this little presentation, is that this is not a realm of the dead. It was an actual place. And as a preterist, preterists argue that this is the same as the lake of fire, mostly, I would say, in Revelation, where the beast and the false prophet and death and Hades are thrown. And I do see similarities there, that they're both building off the same concept. But because death and Hades are thrown in there, and we saw that the rich man received some sort of correctional punishment there, I do think that there's a spiritual side to this concept also. So I'm seeing it as a concept, a kind of a real place where real people were going to, as we'll see from Jesus' statements, are going to in the future receive some correction or actual earthly punishment for their sins. But I think it's mainly focused on that judgment that was coming in 70 AD. And I think there's a good case that can be made for that. Because Jesus did warn about the future punishment that was coming many times. Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. So I think he's talking about the end of the age judgment there. And again, there's a good case to be made that all the Gehenna talk is about that as well. So this text here, but I say to you that everyone who's angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says, you fool, will be liable to the hell, Gehenna, of fire. So here we have the fires of Gehenna. And by the way, just because someone is liable to some kind of earthly fire judgment doesn't mean that that's the end of their body and soul completely, like the end of their entire existence. But the point is that there's no finality here other than like earthly physical finality, maybe. Fire is not an endless punishment to any single person, is what I'm trying to say, or annihilation of the soul of the individual. unless it's talking about the death of the physical body, which I think is totally viable for these texts. In other verses, Jesus talks about the unquenchable fire. There was apparently a fire kept going in the actual place Gehenna. It was known as the fire that was never quenched. So is Jesus using this very kind of vivid visual representation of a real place to warn of the big national judgment to come soon? I mean, clearly Gehenna was seen as a very serious place in olden days. It seems to represent this calamity that was coming, that Jesus spent kind of the entire Olivet Discourse warning about. He talks about the damnation of Gehenna with reference to the Pharisees. And that word damnation means decision, tribunal, or justice, by the way. So fire seems to mean judgment, and Gehenna is a visual representation of what it means to be involved in that judgment. And I don't really see any finality there, other than the final judgment of the Old Covenant, Israel as a nation. Not really individual souls forever. Okay? So, in this one, Matt 5, Jesus says, if your right hand causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away, for it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. So, firstly, I can't really take this verse literally, because it means that you've got body parts missing from people in heaven, right? So I think it's talking more generally about members of the body and losing some members to the judgment, okay, and others being spared that judgment. It's a bit like when Paul talks about branches being cut off. You know, you have your main body of the tree and branches cut off. So I think this is more corporate in nature. That's what I'm going to go with on verses like this. We know that the Christian church in Jerusalem escaped the Roman destruction of Jerusalem, and they fled off to Jordan. So what I'm saying is, they were the members of the whole body that survived, and the Pharisees, etc., were the body parts that were thrown away, right? They were the kind of the right eye that causes you to sin, that got tore out, and they were the members. That was like that's one member that we lost, that guy, and that's another member that we lost. Then your whole body, which is the whole of corporate Israel, be thrown to Gehenna. So out of corporate Israel, we had the remnant, right? So they would be the members that were not thrown to Gehenna, which was the destruction at the end of the age, is what I'm saying. So whoever listened to Jesus and believed on him would escape, and whoever denied him or didn't believe on him would perish, right? With the temple and the city is where I'm going with this. So here's another couple of verses, and it seems closely related to the last verse I talked about. So Matthew 10:28, and be not afraid of those killing the body and are not able to kill the soul, but fear him rather who is able to both kill the soul and body in Gehenna, or destroy in Gehenna both soul and body. And people might say to this, well, there you go, there's a destruction of the soul. But could this also be corporate, the corporate soul of the body, of corporate Israel? if we look at Isaiah 10, which talks about the last days of Israel, it says, the glory of his forest and of his fruitful land, the Lord will destroy, both soul and body. And it will be as when a sick man wastes away. So is Matt 10:28 there actually talking about the body and soul of corporate Israel? The body of Moses? Is it that soul that is being threatened here kind of by Jesus as saying that this is, can we stick with the national judgment theory here is what I'm saying. I mean, really only God could do this. Only he was capable of moving in his providence to kind of destroy the soul of Old Covenant Israel. It's not really talking about individual souls, but more the corporate soul there. So I just want to hand that to you as kind of a thesis. And again, if I'm like violating the Greek or whatever, please leave a message for me. You know, the passage about him bringing a sword, not to bring peace on the earth, but a sword, comes right after this. So I think this is still talking about that end of the age judgment. You know, the nation, the body, and the soul, kind of their exclusive law and the sinful lawlessness which the law exposed, that is kind of the soul that's being referred to here. Okay? That's what I'm thinking anyway. People will often bring up this verse and say, here's God threatening, like, here's an example of a soul being destroyed. But is it? Is what I'm asking. So here's more Gehenna texts. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how are you to escape being sentenced to hell, Gehenna? So I think this is certainly talking about the judgment on that generation, right? So that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth. He's talking about that generation. He's talking about the sentence to Gehenna again. So I think this is still talking about earthly stuff, about worldly destruction mainly. The sentence to Gehenna is the sentence of national judgment in 70 AD in the whole context of Matthew 23 and 24 and Matthew 25 actually. This is a one in James, and the tongue is a fire of world of unrighteousness. The tongue is set among our members, straining the whole body, or staining the whole body, setting on fire the entire course of life, and set on fire by hell, Gehenna. So this judgment of Gehenna, the end of the age judgment, is setting on fire these tongues that are being insulting. So I think this links back up to Matthew 5:22 about talking about your brother in an insulting way, right? So, I mean, this is again talking badly about people, and that's going to receive its judgment also. The tongue that is fiery will be handled by the fire of judgment that was still kind of about to come when this book, the book of James, was written. This is still pre-70 AD. So could this also be restricted to the judgment in 70 AD of the Old Covenant people? Is this still a warning to them? I would say that's a viable view. So moving on from Gehenna to Tartarus, it's only mentioned once, I believe, even if you count the Septuagint. And it's a bit of a funny one, that it does seem to describe some kind of imprisonment of messengers. A lot of people view this as kind of spiritual angels and these kinds of concepts. But I don't think it's talking about spiritual angelic messengers here. It says, for if God messengers, or sometimes it says, for if God's angels who sinned did not spare, he did not spare, but with chains of thick gloom, having cast them down to Tartarus, did deliver them to judgment, having been reserved. Now, I think that it can cause a misunderstanding if there's angels in there. Tartarus is a term borrowed from Greek mythology, where it's not, I believe, used as a place of torture or annihilation either, as far as I know. But in the context of 2 Peter, I think it's clearly pointing towards the wicked false prophets, right, and false teachers, because that's what the early chapter is all about. There in 2 Peter. So it seems to be very first century focused, because we know that there was lots of antichrists running around being false prophets. I mean, full preterists will know all about this. This is how we explain to futurists when they say, well, where was all the false prophets and that? That's all got to be future. And we say, no, look at these texts, which clearly show there was lots of false prophets claiming things back then. And later in 2 Peter, he says, if by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes, he condemned them to extinction, making them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly. So it seems to be a scene of what will happen to Jerusalem in the last days again. You know, Jerusalem is called Sodom in Revelation, and their bodies will lie in the street of the great city that symbolically is called Sodom and Egypt, where the Lord was crucified. So that's got to be Jerusalem as well. So I think, again, there's a case to be made here that Tartarus, in its only mention in the Bible, is talking about worldly, earthly messengers or teachers, the false teachers and the false prophets. These were the messengers who sinned, or the angels who sinned. Angelos meaning messengers. So they're false messengers. They're sinful messengers. Okay? Again, if you don't agree with me on these things, I'm not trying to convince you, but I'm just trying to offer the other view, so that maybe if a pastor or whoever is talking to someone who's putting forward like a different and other than orthodox view of hell, maybe you can have a little bit more understanding. Like that, it makes sense to me. I mean, I'm just thinking these things through. So I'm going to wrap it up, because I really don't want these videos to go on for too long. I know that people have a shorter attention span these days. I don't want to make it hour plus. So all I'm saying is we're very far removed, okay, from the sayings of the day. You know, I don't think we can build really hard doctrines on these complex, difficult to comprehend passages, especially about Gehenna and about what Jesus said, because I think that is very Israel focused and very end of the age focused, kind of talking to a specific people at a specific time. The Bible isn't really clear about what goes on in the Gehenna of this age, or even if there is one. Okay, so I don't think there is a Gehenna in this age, because it referred exclusively to that judgment. So I think when you have that understanding, where the Bible is hazy about what goes on kind of in the afterlife, I think we need to fall back on we believe the character of God is and his desires and aims are. But I'm going to leave that to next week. Okay. I also need to, in the end game, who comes out as the winner? This is going to be another one for next week. Like, God desires all to be saved, but then he loses the vast majority, which is the traditional view. So this is the subject that's closely related to this. And some of you might be asking, well, if you don't believe that bad people are tortured or destroyed permanently, then what do you believe? What happens to them exactly? And I will pick up on that. Okay? I promise next week. But at the moment, my message is basically that I don't think that there is a place called hell that is a perpetual torture chamber or an extinction mechanism for the lost. Okay? We should have a bit of patience for those who hold a different view. I think I've put forth kind of a decent enough case that there might be another view to hold, which I currently hold. I might not hold it forever, but I hold it currently. And I think there's a lot in the Bible about Gehenna, for example, that doesn't apply to us today. And I think it's worth thinking about that. Jesus did spend a lot of time talking about it, but I think he was warning about an earthly judgment that is all past. So it was very valuable as it pertains to fulfilled prophecy. But and saving the church from that judgment, because he was urging them to listen to him and to believe on him to avoid that judgment, right, of Gehenna. He told them to flee from it when they saw the signs, right? So I think it's worth pushing the beautiful nature rather than pushing the threat, this traditional view of hell, rather than pushing that as a threat to kind of, scare people out of their wits and get them to change their beliefs or their ways. I think seeing as love works no ill and good news is going to have a better effect on people than threats, then we can just focus on that, I think. I think that would be a better way, than this hazy concept of what happens when we die and the bad news of what will happen to people who either don't believe or whose conduct isn't good enough. So this is where I am in how I look at hell at the moment, and I look forward to your thoughts. And that's all from me this week, and I'll see you next time.